Hello everyone, this is going to be a lore video for Heavy Gear Blitz. Now, you may have seen the introductory video that's been posted. If not, go take a quick look at that and see what we're talking about. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to talk about the history of the universe, what's going on, who are the major players, so that you have an idea going forward. Now, we are probably going to do a gameplay dive later on, where we talk about these factions from a gameplay standpoint. But for now, this is entirely fluff, lore, whatever you want to call it. So a little bit of a history lesson. In 4582, humanity invented something called a gate drive. And basically what gates are is they're essentially micro black holes that fold space. What the gate drives do is they hit a certain energy threshold and allow ships to cross through the gate. So the nice thing about this is you have singular points that translate to a set endpoint. And there's a ship on each side, or on one side, that opens it. Now, humanity expanded from Earth to a solar system that was hundreds of light years away from Earth, and there wasn't much there. They jumped to another solar system from that one and found a system that had dozens of these gates, potential gates. And this system would later be colonized as the planet of Caprice, but through here, humanity began its true extrasolar colonization. And in 4752, a planet called Terra was discovered. This is referred to as the Terra calendar year 1. And major colonization efforts began around 5104. And by the Terra calendar, that's 493. Now, you may be trying to do a little bit of math there and say, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't work. Bear with you a minute. We'll talk a little bit about that dating system. But anyway, after this colonization effort, humanity ended up with about 9 total planets that had been colonized. And they were colonized to a decent level, hundreds of thousands of people, reasonably self-sufficient. And everything was going fine and dandy until 5790, or 1454 by the Terra calendar, when massive internal issues in Earth, economic collapse, political upheaval, resulted in the mothballing of the gate ship fleet, which meant that gates could not be opened again. And the result was these colonies that had once been partially reliant on Earth, they had to be reasonably self-sufficient, but were partly reliant on Earth, were now completely isolated. And Terra experiences this period of isolation for about 500 cycles. Cycles are the Terra equivalent to a year. So, with that having been abandoned, the outposts and cities left on the planet are essentially in a state of confusion. The lifeline back to Earth has been severed, and they are now on their own. So this sees a shift of these cities and communities to very independent entities that are more akin to city-states. It's a city, its outlying area, maybe a few smaller communities that is entirely self-sufficient. And the reason for this is the population density of Terra is comically small. We'll get to that when we talk a little bit about the planet. But these city-states eventually came into conflict with each other as they fought over resources. And over time, the city-states banded together to form what are called leagues, which are nations today, is the best way to think about them. And then eventually these leagues were united. And the spark for that uniting happened in 1669. So in the north, there are 3 leagues: the Northern Lights Confederacy, the Mercantile Federation, and the Western Frontier Protectorate. And they'd been fighting each other for a couple hundred cycles at this point, after Earth abandoned them. Well, the other powers eventually gang up on the Federation, because the Federation is an industrial powerhouse. And in a conflict in a Federation city, the Mercantile Federation army puts everything they have into the battle. This includes arming construction and loading equipment with guns because they desperately needed the hardware. Much to everyone's shock, these bipedal construction robots refitted for combat did incredibly well. And the reason why is because of the city-states. The city-states were very concentrated, highly developed areas that made traditional armor very difficult. So you couldn't drive a tank down a lot of the roads. But because they were armored and could carry a lot of weapons, they outclassed infantrymen. So the United Mercantile Federation took this concept and ran with it, and they developed what they called the Heavy Gear. Their first model was called the Hunter, and it was a revelation in arms design. Now, to the south, the Southern Republic, the largest league on Terra Nova, had been fighting its rivals in the south and saw this new development as a chance to claim victory. A Southern Republic commando team hijacked a Hunter prototype with all the necessary equipment to make it and brought it back to the Southern Republic. One cycle later, the Southern Republic produced the Jaeger, which was a direct Hunter ripoff with a few minor local changes, and less than a cycle later, they had conquered the entire Southern Hemisphere. So we end up in a situation where the heavy gear has been developed as a result of construction equipment, and the South is united as the Allied Southern Territories under the thumb of the Southern Republic. The Northern Leagues, however, weren't so keen on uniting. They didn't think the Southern Territories was really anything more than just a paper alliance. All of that changed in what was called the Merchant War. The North stayed separate, and the United Mercantile Federation essentially got into a blood feud with one of the Southern Leagues called the Mekong Dominion over a resource-rich area on the planet. They went to war, and the Dominion, backed up by the entirety of the Allied Southern Territories, quickly defeated the UMF resoundingly. The northern city-states looked at this and said, "Ooh, we have a problem." So they united in the Confederated Northern City-States. So we have two power blocks now, the CNCS, or the North, and the AST, the South. And in between them is a resource-rich area called the Badlands. And for the next 200 and some change cycles, these two essentially, it's like the Cold War, but partially hot. They're fighting skirmishes, proxy wars, there's a few decent scale wars that come out of it, and the Badlands are the battlegrounds. And everything was going all hunky-dory until 1913, when Earth showed back up. Earth did not come with an olive branch, however. Earth came with a whole lot of guns. So while Terra Nova is in the process of, I don't want to say normalizing, but coming to its current state, the Earth is in complete chaos. The Earth sphere is in complete chaos. All the colony worlds are abandoned. World War III breaks out. And eventually out of that, one power comes to the New Earth Coalition. And eventually they take over Earth. They rejoin with the rest of the solar system. And in order to fix what had been damaged, they decide they want the colonies back. And they realize that the colonies may not be too keen on this because they kind of abandoned the colonies. So they go in loaded for bear with a full-scale invasion. When Earth shows up to Terra Nova, their expectation is that these polar forces that have been fighting each other for hundreds of cycles at this point will just keep doing it, and Earth will come and sweep the field. Unfortunately, they were wrong. And over 4 cycles, which is about 2.5 years, the combined Terra Nova forces drove the Earth fleet off in a war called the War of the Alliance. Feeling that they had defeated the Earth and that the threat was diminished, things kind of went back to normal. The two leagues generally became antagonistic to each other, and this erupted in the largest war they ever fought, called the Polar War, which was fought around the 1930s. This was a rather bloody conflict between the North and the South. A lot of the Badlands communities were hit hard, as they were the central war zones. But eventually a broker came in to discuss peace terms. And that is a city-state called Peace River, which is a Badlands power. Essentially, they're the largest weapons manufacturer on the planet. They came up and said, we will negotiate peace between these two powers. Unfortunately, Earth sabotaged them. They detonated an antimatter bomb in the Peace River main city, destroyed the entire city, although most of the manufacturing was underground. And this was eventually traced back to Earth agents, and this reminded the polar powers that Earth is not gone. They're going to be back. Better stop the bloodshed now so we can rebuild, rearm, and be ready. So while they're doing that, the powers also form a specialist commando unit called the Black Talons. It's a multinational, somewhat private army based in Peace River. And they were sent off-world. And their job was to gather equipment, intel, deployments, work with local resistance units, to fight against Earth and essentially brace the punch that was coming on Terra Nova. So that was going on, and then eventually in 1951, the current year in the game, Earth showed back up, bigger fleet with Colonial auxiliaries, and the war for Terra Nova, the second Earth invasion, has begun. Unfortunately, much as in the case of the first conflict, but even a little more so, sparks fly between these rivals. While they are united against Earth, the powers of Terra Nova are not united themselves. So this is where we are now. Earth and its colonial auxiliaries have invaded Terra Nova. The powers are fighting back, but they're still fighting a bit amongst each other. So let's talk a little bit about Terra Nova. So Terra Nova is slightly smaller and more dense than Earth, and it's comically rich in minerals. It actually has life forms on it, like full-on animals and all that, and it has a closer orbital rotation than our Earth does. The massive spread of population comes from the fact that Terra Nova has less than a tenth of Earth's population. I think it's somewhere around 500 million, maybe. And most of it's concentrated at the poles, where temperatures are much more moderate. It's still hot. Snow, open water are not terribly common, but it's much more hospitable down there. The northern polar hemisphere is, think like forest, like North American forest. The south is a little bit more tropical. Most of the people live in the city-states, and there's some communities in the Badlands, which are a large band of desert, essentially, that separates the two poles. They're very sparsely populated. There's very little centralized government out there. There's two of them we'll get to, but in general, it's kind of viewed as a lawless area. And then just a few notes about the planet. It's generally a dry planet. There is some open water, but most of it's underground. And the Terra Nova year, called a cycle, is about 160 days, which is why the years don't exactly line up. You know, we're in Terra Nova 1913. It's like 62-something in the regular Gregorian calendar. So with that out of the way, let's talk about some of the factions here. The Northern Alliance is called the Confederated Northern City-States, or simply the North for short. It consists of three subnations: the Northern Lights Confederacy, which is not quite a religious theocracy, but it's a democracy that might as well be. The population is very religious. It's the largest nation in the North, and while it is a democracy, anybody who's not a member of their religion is viewed as a second-class citizen. The United Mercantile Federation, this is a government-run, I don't want to say, it's run by business. The way that they work is you buy electoral vouchers and you use that to vote. So there are no taxes. The government is entirely funded through the purchase of electoral votes, and companies are allowed to purchase votes. And they do so in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands. The main manufacturing hub in the North is centered here. So most northern equipment tends to be built in the Federation. And then the last nation is the Western Frontier Protectorate. It's the smallest of the three by quite a bit. Because of its position fairly far south and the fact that it's fairly small, it's been on the receiving end of a lot of wars, and it's almost, I don't want to say fascist, but a very militarist state. Very conservative militarist state. And the basic premise here is that soldiers are the only citizens. You have to serve 5 years in the military, 10 years in the generic Northern Army, which is called the Northern Guard. We'll get to that in a moment. And then 20 years in equivalent military in another league to be a citizen. The premise of the North is it's an alliance of equals. These are not one is better than the rest. And the biggest issue facing the North is they are a bastion for what's called the revisionist faith. The revisionist faith is a faith that is local to Terra Nova, and it basically says that the faithful have to make the world moral and right through violent means. And this can cause a lot of friction as we get further south. It's a very conservative religion, so when it comes to some more open ideas, the North isn't terribly tolerant. I did mention a central northern military. That's called the Northern Guard. It is a small, highly professional army that exists to operate and handle border skirmishes in peacetime, and in war, the armies of the three smaller leagues merge with it. and it creates a centralized command structure so there's a single united northern military in times of war. To the south, we have the Allied Southern Territories. This consists of 4 leagues. The Southern Republic, it's the largest league on Terra Nova. It's a very liberal area, just in terms of how its people work, so long as you don't question the government. If you question the government, bad things are going to happen. They are the center of the Allied Southern Territories. They essentially run it, and they made it by force. The Mekong Dominion is a government run mostly by businesses. The electoral body is based off of leaders who essentially own businesses, and it operates as the industrial base of the Southern Territories. The Eastern Sons Emirates are semi-feudal. Calling them a nation is a bit of a stretch. Basically, it's ruled over by the descendants of the crew of a starship that crashed in the area. They are the haves, everyone else is the have-nots, and in some cases, it's pretty bad for the lower populations. The Humanist Alliance is a utopian-based caste society, so you belong to a caste, you have your job, and that's it. Best tech on the planet, good manufacturing capability, highly trained military, if a bit eccentric. The South is predominantly run by the Southern Republic. Technically, it's an alliance, but the Republic runs everything. It is somewhat unstable because of this. Local government policies, internal rivalries. The Eastern Sun Emirates, for example, is essentially an ongoing civil war for all intents and purposes. The Southern Republic and the Humanist Alliance have never really gotten along. Recent Southern Republic actions have resulted in significant damage to the Humanist Alliance. You get a very unstable nation. Each of the elites does have a military like the North. There is a centralized one called the militia. And unlike the Northern Guard, which is the elite of the North, the militia is the dregs. There's a lot of them. They don't have the best equipment, but they're the face of the Southern Territories. The Southern Republican Army is actually its main backbone. All right, Peace River. I mentioned these guys. They were the ones who served as a broker, essentially, to try and end the Polar War. Peace River is a military force owned by a company called Paxton Arms. Paxton Arms is the largest weapons producer on the planet. They make gears, they make guns, they make tanks, they make aircraft, and they make everything else that you can imagine. Because of the massive damage the Badlands sustain in the wars between the polar powers, and even just to general banditry and raiding, Peace River has built an army to essentially protect that. Their job is to protect the workers and resources. Officially, they maintain neutrality between the North and the South, but they do that so they can sell to both sides. The other thing they do is anytime there's competition, be it in the North or be it in the South or in other places, they're not against using their military forces to secure company interests through a little bit of violent sabotage. The Peace River Army consists of local defense forces, militias, its assorted special forces, and peacekeeping units. It's a conglomerate military force. It's not the largest on Terra Nova, but it's very well equipped, because when you make your own equipment, you can have a lot of it and you get the good stuff. The often target of this sabotage is the New Coalition. So the New Coalition is another power. They're centered in the Badlands. They are essentially a league that is just beginning. So they're not quite North or South level powerful, but they're on par with the smaller ones. And it started as an economic agreement with some military basis among Badlands communities because they were sick and tired of just getting run over by the North and the South. They were getting blown up. Entire cities were being wiped out. They said enough is enough. We're going to work together to try and stop this. And eventually it turned into a military alliance. So a few key members, you have Port Arthur. So Port Arthur is a city-state with a significant population. Interestingly enough, the remnants of the First Earth invasion actually have gone native and live in Port Arthur. There weren't quite enough ships to get them all off planet, and they had two choices. You can either live on Terra Nova, or you can just die. So they opted to live on Terra Nova. The Humanist Alliance actually has a significant presence in the New Coalition. They were actually attacked by the Southern Republic, or at least a plague was done, that essentially wiped out their upper leadership. And in preparation for this, large amounts of Humanist personnel and equipment were moved to the New Coalition, where the League essentially exists in exile. And then the rest of the New Coalition is a bunch of city-states that have banded together in these various communities. And the way that this works is they each maintain a certain number of regiments and pay taxes to fund a centralized military. So the nice thing about this is it's voluntary. They don't use violence to get people to join them, and it's an economic and military alliance. It was formed after the War of the Alliance, and during the Polar War, that proved it was successful. They were able to hold off polar incursions. Yes, they can't fight them, but they can keep them from messing with the local communities. And at the end, they actually made quite a bit of money off of the war because in the post-war, they were in decent shape. This massive influx has allowed them to undergo significant research and development to equip their armies with very top-of-the-line tech that's a mix of both Earth and Terra Nova equipment. So it's a very high-tech army, very high-speed army. This is the army that has hovercraft and hover tanks. Earth has that, but this is a mix of all of them. Sorry, I need a drink there. All right, the Black Talons. So the Black Talons are what happened after Earth sabotaged the Polar War peace negotiations. They set off an antimatter bomb. It was traced back to Earth, and in order to aggressively prepare for the next Earth invasion, the Black Talons were formed as essentially a semi-independent private army. They recruit pilots from all the nations. Their equipment is actually purchased from all the other nations, and in many cases upgraded, although they do have their own line that has recently come out. Top-of-the-line pilots, top-of-the-line equipment. Their job is to go out and either aggressively recon, disrupt, or serve as a strike group for CEF locations. So they might be aiding allies on another planet. So the other colonies, we'll get to them in a moment, have some resistance movements. The Black Talons may be helping that. The Black Talons may just be doing general recon. What is Earth doing? Where are its forces going? And they also operate on Terra Nova as an elite strike force. The Leagueless, this model is not a Leagueless model, just for the record, mostly because there aren't any, and we'll get to that in a moment. So these are the people who don't belong to a major power. They're essentially everybody else. They essentially exist in the Badlands. They're on the verge of disaster. It's a bunch of small tribes, crime families, you name it. Their equipment is scavenged, stolen, or in some cases given to them, depending on who's working with what. These machines get very customized because there's not access to spare parts. They're often in poor repair. And interesting to note in-game, they actually have no models because you can pick from a bunch of the other factions. The CEF, the Colonial Expeditionary Force. This is the military force Earth built to reconquer the colonies. It has a human command staff, but the bulk of its armies are made up by Grells, genetically reconstituted legionnaires. They're essentially large. They actually have a purple skin tone. They're almost entirely stable, not completely, and they're treated as equipment. Essentially, it's a slave army for all intents and purposes. They pilot the tanks, different classes of Grell handle aircraft, technician roles, you name it. Initially, they did not have combat walkers, and used a force consistent entirely of hover tanks, mechanized infantry, etc., to do a very blitzkrieg-inspired type of warfare. Unfortunately, the long distances in Terra Nova meant that wasn't quite reasonable. The targets were very far separated from each other, and gears, they didn't consider the gears especially valuable, but were very surprised when those gears proved to be highly effective. So much so that they took a number of samples back with them and developed their own line of combat walkers called frames. It's worth noting that Earth tech is not necessarily more advanced than Terra Nova, they just went a different direction with it. Earth tech, for example, didn't really work with the bipedal combat systems. Instead, they made hover tanks, very efficient hover tanks. Whereas on Terra Nova, all attempts at hover tanks were rare and didn't really work that well, but the combat walkers got more attention. So it's not really more advanced, they just went a different direction. And it's worth noting that the CEF holds, I think it's technically 4 colonies under an Iron Fist, but they don't really rule all of them. They think they do, but they don't really rule all of them. And one of those colonies is Caprice. So Caprice is the first colony conquered by Earth, and the reason why is because it's that system I mentioned at the start that had a bunch of gates to a bunch of other planets. It's the central gate world. It's the hub that all other colonization happened through. The conquest of Caprice was essentially bloodless because the entire population was concentrated in a trench and the Earth forces threatened to bomb it. So, seeing no other option, Caprice surrendered, but they didn't take it lightly. So, resistance movements exist. They used to just be annoyances. Now they're actively funded by some members of the Caprice government. They're backed up by Black Talons, and you have a resistance movement on Caprice. Other corporate units are sent. Caprice is run largely by corporations, by the way. They don't really have a standing army. It's more police forces. Caprice military units are often sent with the CEF on Terra Nova, so these units do show up on Terra Nova. And unlike the other nations, or the other powers, they don't use bipedal walkers. They use things called mounts, which is, you see one here that's called an Afek. They kind of walk like spiders, and the idea is because they live in a trench, they need very maneuverable machines. Another colony is Utopia. So Utopia, as its name would imply, was a nice verdant garden world, and after Earth abandoned them, they nuked it. The locals nuked each other, biological, chemical weapons, and this forced them to live underground and use drones for warfare. So the CEF took over by supporting one of the powers in the local power struggle, after seeing that, hey, Terra Nova didn't quite work out the way we thought. And very quickly, Utopia ended up under CEF control. It is almost entirely under CEF control. There are no major resistance forces. And Utopian armies now take to battle with the CEF using their human-based controller units controlling hordes of drones. This drone here is called an Enkidu. So you're going to see lots of hordes, lots of machines. They look quite like that. They have some other units. It's not all little drones like this. But for the most part, it's lots of drones controlled by a few human pilots. The last power that has models in the game is called Eden. So Eden is actually a feudal society of nobles and princes. They tended to have show wars where they would go out, fight a little bit, almost no loss of life, kind of almost war for sport. When Earth showed up, however, a horrible accident occurred that destroyed about half the CEF fleet, and they thought the Edenites had attacked them. So the CEF showed up, started bombing Edenite homes and positions. The initial CEF assault ended up being just this incredibly brutal assault. And because of this, they took control of the planet. A lot of people on Eden are not happy. They blame the CEF for their planet is now cooling down at a very fast rate, endangering the viability of the colony, actually. They saw the massive loss of life and brutality of the Earth invasion and are very unhappy. So where Caprice is kind of 50-50, there's resistance elements, there's not resistance elements. Utopia is very pro-CEF. Eden is not. This is the closest colony that the Earth has to not being in control. And before we go, a few of the other colonies here. There's actually 9 of them, and here's the rest of them. So Atlantis, as you might expect by its name, is a water world. CEF showed up, took over the itty-bitty tiny bit of landmass, and then promptly got their butts kicked when they went underwater because the Atlanteans know how to make submarines really well. They're well-equipped and well-versed for underwater warfare, and the CEF was not. So Atlantis is technically controlled in that all the landmass is under control, but the overwhelming majority of the population and manufacturing capability is heavily contested. Botany Bay is originally a prison planet, but has gotten a society out of it. There's not a lot clear in the fluff exactly what's going on there. Home is owned by a company, and that company has survived till this day. And seeing that there really wasn't a lot they could do because they weren't really militarized, they accepted CEF control, and they've actually been working with a lot of genetics and a lot of tech. So Home is kind of the academic hub of the world. Jotunheim was a private enclave that basically said, get off my lawn. When Earth launched its first invasion, it thought it'd be a cakewalk. There's only a handful of cities. Didn't see any active military forces. They landed on Jotunheim, only to reveal that most of the cities are actually underground. Jotunheim armies poured out in numbers Earth had no comprehension of or even imagined could exist, and the CEF force was wiped out. The only thing that was sent back with them was a message that said something to the effect of, we will not have your masters. The last colony is New Jerusalem, was actually purchased and owned and run by the Catholic Church. A CEF fleet went there and never came back. Nobody has any idea what happened to them. So these colonies here don't have any presence in the game yet, although there's a decent chance a lot of them are going to show up eventually. So I hope you enjoyed that. It was a little bit long, my apologies, but it's mostly just covering the history of the world. So have a good one.
Hey, this is Dave. If you like what we're doing here at What Game Now, go ahead and click on one of the videos which should be on either side of me, or click right in the middle and go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the bell once you subscribe so that you know when we have new videos. Please go ahead and share us with your friends. Let everybody know that we're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for all of our subscribers already. And we look forward to bringing you more content every chance that we get.